So I'm really glad to give you the European perspective, and then we'll also listen, as was mentioned earlier, to the example of Krakow, Poland. So I'm really excited also to learn more about what they're doing at the moment. And I called this presentation "Successful but Controversial?" Lessons from low emission zones in European cities. If you have been reading the newspapers, then probably you saw that, for example, in London, there's been a really big debate recently on the ultra low emission zone, which is the biggest and the most ambitious low emission zone that we have in the world for now. And it's also in many other cities quite a hot topic, and we wanted to provide some perspective on this. I'll try to speak slowly for the interpreters, knowing that it's not always easy to follow. So if I speak too fast, please just let me know somehow. Before we start with the topic, just a few words about who we are. Maybe you are wondering yourself, who's the Clean Cities campaign? So we are a non-governmental organization, a network of more than 85 organizations from 20 different countries in Europe. And we all work on a shared vision, which is to go to zero emission urban transport by around 2030. So that's quite soon, but we think it's necessary to protect the climate, to protect our health in terms of air pollution. And we work specifically on low and zero emission zones, and I will define them later in the presentation, but also school streets, so closing traffic in front of schools and kindergartens at certain times at least. And also we work a lot on active, so cycling and walking, shared transport as well, car sharing, bike sharing, e-scooter sharing, and electric mobility in general. And we really want to work with the cities and with the people on the ground. So we've got that big network, and we speak to city officials from a lot of cities. We don't want to work against them, but really help them and encourage them to be as ambitious as possible. So in the next 15 minutes or so, this is what I'm going to speak about. First of all, a quick overview of what are low emission zones, why do we need them? Secondly, what are the trends that we're seeing across European cities? And also then, many of you will wonder, what's the impact that we can hope for when it comes to low emission zones? And then most importantly, I think also for the work you're doing in different cities and countries is, what are the main challenges when implementing low emission zones?
Kihívásokat is meg fogunk tekinteni, hogy mik a fő kihívások a LEZ-ek számára. Láthatjuk, hogy milyen közép- és kelet-európai városokban mennyire állnak készen ezekre. Lesznek olyanok, hogy nagyon érdekes lesz, hogy majd a ti visszajelzéseket is hallhassuk. A végén a tiszta városok ajánlásait is meg fogjuk nézni, hogy milyen hatékony és igazságos lehet az alacsony kibocsátási zónák. Tehát kezdjük el, hogy mik is azok az alacsony kibocsátású zónák.
Urban access regulations, and it has a big map on all the low emission zones and similar policies in European cities. And the way they define it is also very much how we define it, which is low emission zones are areas. Usually it's cities, can also be sometimes regions, areas in which the most polluting vehicles are regulated. And usually that means that vehicles with high emissions cannot enter the area. Or sometimes in some cities, they can pay to enter the area. That depends a bit. For example, in London, you can pay to enter. In most cities, you can't enter if you're more polluting. So it's really that kind of regulation on the emissions of a car, usually with a focus on air pollution. Second question. So if we know what low emission zones are, why do we need them? So we all know that air pollution in our cities specifically is a big problem. The EU says that we've more than 230,000 premature deaths a year, and a lot of people are suffering, of course. So even if you don't die, you can get lung cancer, strokes, asthma, dementia, many other things. Like, research tells us that almost every part of the body is negatively affected by air pollution. And sometimes we're so used to it that we don't see it anymore. But if you look at the lungs of people, for example, at the end of their life, if they lived in cities, you can really see the impact. And we also know that children, the elderly, chronically sick people are more susceptible, so they're more vulnerable. And also low-income neighborhoods or people on low incomes, they also are at a higher risk. They often have to live in areas where there's more traffic and more pollution, and they have less good access to healthcare. And most importantly, the new studies also show that even if we respect today's laws on air quality, it's still not safe, because even at very low levels of pollution, based on the data of hundreds of thousands of people, it has been shown that the negative impact is still there. So even if we comply with today's laws, we're not safe yet. And the problem is that most of the EU urban population currently lives in cities and in areas where the World Health Organization guidelines are exceeded. So 90% of the population lives about in areas where the NO2 levels are not respected, and 97% live in areas. Sorry, just my son needs cinema. He's sick at home. 1 second. That's the joy of modern parenthood. When the kids are sick, then the parents and the fathers have to step in. So most of the population in cities is really living at levels that the World Health Organization does not consider safe. 90% for NO2, 97% for PM2.5. So now what are the trends of low emission zones, knowing that we need them to really curb air pollution? We see that we already see a positive trend, an increase in the number of low emission zones. In 2019, there were 228. 2022, when we checked last year, so we used a big European database, the one that I mentioned earlier with the definition, we always saw an increase to 320 LEZs. And by 2025, according to current plans, we expect them to go up to more than 500. And also there are already plans for around 35 zero emission zones, and I will speak about them a bit later. So you can clearly see that there is a trend. More and more cities are using the tool of low emission zones to curb air pollution. And so if you look at the map, that's also, of course, very interesting for today's event. You can see that on the one hand, in Western and Northern Europe, there are quite a lot of these policies, and they were historically the leaders of these policies. They started first, and they... so you can see that in North and West of Europe, there are a lot of these zones. In Southern Europe, if you look, for example, Italy and Spain here, you can also see that there's been quite a strong increase. So at the top, you see the number in 2022, and then by 2025, we expect a further increase. So you can really see that there is a trend with a high increase in certain countries, but you also see that in Central and Eastern Europe, there's not a lot for now. We will hear about Poland later, but we also think that a lot of cities have been thinking about low emission zones. We know, for example, about cities not only in Poland, but also Bulgaria and the Czech Republic, for example. We know it's a discussion also in Budapest to some extent, so it's really important to keep in mind that so far it's been quite unequal in how it's been rolled out. So what's the impact that we can hope for in terms of low emission zones? I mentioned earlier that we have a real air pollution problem in cities, and the main motivation for low emission zones is really to curb toxic air pollution. What we've seen, for example, is that in London, there's been a 44% reduction of NO2 levels. So that's the pollution mainly coming from diesel cars. And in Madrid, with a similar low emission zone, we also saw a 32% drop. And we analyzed all the scientific evidence. We commissioned experts to review the literature. And they found that typically the reductions are around 20% in a wide range of conditions. And then the main impact is really on NO2, but you can also have a positive impact on particulate matter levels. That depends also on the vehicle fleet and on how old the fleet is. So it's usually not the main reduction that you're seeing, and the numbers are a bit lower. And you can also see a reduction in greenhouse gases. For example, in London, we saw between 3 and 9% drop inside the zone. So it's also good for the climate. And it can also help you if you combine it with other policies to reduce car ownership and hence the space that you need in cities. For example, in the end, Belgium, that was done. The real impact will always depend not only on how stringent the policies, but also on the vehicle fleet and the local conditions. So it will vary city by city, but we've seen that in hundreds of cities, it works. And the exact impact depends on how you design it. Now, looking a bit more into the future, we know that low emission zones in the longer term will not be good enough, because we know that a lot of the pollution still remains in the air, even if we use somewhat newer cars. So what's more and more happening in Europe is that we work on zero emission zones. There would be areas in which, you can see it on the right here, there's only walking and cycling or vehicles with zero tailpipe emissions. So mainly electric vehicles, in some cases also hydrogen vehicles, for example. And in a study that we commissioned, we modeled what such a zero emission zone could mean for air pollution. So you can see the number here is the estimated level of NO2, so nitrogen dioxide, the diesel pollutant, in a zero emission zone in 2030. And it shows you what part comes from traffic, the blue part, and the gray part is the other sources, which of course are not tackled usually in the low emission zones that we work on, for example, heating industry and so on. And you can really see that if you introduce a zero emission zone, you can go quite low on NO2 levels, but still not fully to what the World Health Organization recommends, which is 10 micrograms per cubic meter. So we know zero emission zones will have to come at some point, but also we, of course, need to work on the other sources of pollution. That's very important too. Now, what are the main challenges when implementing low emission zones? So we're keeping track of what's happening in a lot of cities, and we can see the same questions coming up a lot of the time, and we try to also provide you an idea of how to answer them. So first of all, is a low emission zone really necessary? And there the answer clearly is, in almost all of the cities, road traffic is one of the main sources of pollution still, despite the improvements that we've seen in vehicles. Especially for NO2, it's the main source. And we know, as I mentioned earlier, the children, the elderly, deprived neighborhoods, they're all really exposed. So there's no question that we need to work on air pollution, and traffic is always in the picture. Secondly, there's a lot of questions, do low emission zones really work? And you saw below that we already have more than 300 zones in place. That scientific literature and the case studies have shown they do curb air pollution. I showed you the numbers above, for example, minus 44% in London for NO2. So the effects are there, that can be estimated, and it is possible to improve air quality. Third question usually is, isn't it unfair towards drivers? Because they have to buy a new vehicle or move differently. And so clearly here, the idea is not to punish drivers, but to enable them to either switch to other modes of transport, which often is also cheaper and healthier, walking, cycling, public transport, and so on. Or if they need their cars and their vehicles, then to purchase less polluting vehicles. And there's a lot of solutions, I will mention a few later, that can be put in place. Fourthly, how can you enforce such a policy? So there are several solutions, one of them being, for example, video enforcement with recognition of the license plates. Also, the police can do visual controls on the vehicles. And finally, there's often the argument that local businesses will have to close if people can't drive to the shops, the restaurants, the companies anymore and park in front. So we did a literature review on examples from all over the world, especially Europe. And it clearly shows also, if you think about the most vibrant parts of your cities often, or the most economically strong cities in Europe, that these are also cities where it's possible to move around without owning a car. So for example, the pedestrian zones are usually also where you have the highest turnover in shops. And during COVID, we've seen a few experiments in many countries where traffic was closed, and it really, in that difficult period, helped the shops and the restaurants. So then looking at Central and Eastern Europe, we also have a few colleagues working on the ground there in different countries, also on our team with people coming from these countries. And so we try to also keep in mind that there are specific challenges in that region. And as I said earlier, of course, they're not always the same, but there's a few common patterns that we at least think we see. One of them is that is limited availability of reliable and up-to-date air pollution data and modeling. So compared to cities, big cities, for example, like Paris, London, and Brussels, in many cities, and not only in Central and Eastern Europe, but maybe a bit more there, we see that there's a lack of good data and modeling. Secondly, I think that's very prominent in some cities in Central and Eastern Europe. We see that other pollution sources are quite important too. For example, heating, depending on the fuels and the coal and everything that you use. So the role of traffic often is less clear to people. So we know we have to tackle traffic, but we also have to tackle the other pollution sources. But it makes it harder to explain that to people when there's a big pollution coming from other sources. Thirdly, we also think that there's sometimes a lower sense of urgency because there's other problems that are seen as more pressing, and understandably so in many cases. But we still need to work on the awareness of the need to clean up transport. And it's not a luxury for one day, but it's something we can and should be doing now. Fourthly, there's also strong concerns around the affordability in all cities and countries. But of course, if the income levels on average are a bit lower, then it's even more prominent. So the question, how can we make sure that everybody can be taken along and can afford the change? And I can mention a few examples just afterwards on how to do that. And finally, we also have a high share of imported, very polluting cars in many cases. So the legacy of the Dieselgate scandal. And that's also something, of course, that is a bit harder to tackle also under EU law. But we really are convinced that everyone has the right to clean air wherever you live, and you can find the right solution. You obviously won't start with the level that London has chosen now after having done a lot of things, or Madrid, or Paris, or other cities. So it's a stepwise process. You don't start with the most ambitious thing in the world, ideally, and you give people enough time. But if you do that, then there's no reason why it shouldn't work in your cities too. And sometimes I think we also have to make sure that we don't defeat ourselves, so that we don't see ourselves more negatively than we are. So for example, we did a recent research where we ranked cities on shared and zero emission transport. So 4 things: shared bikes and e-scooters, shared electric cars, zero-emission buses, and charging infrastructure for electric cars. And for example, you can see that Ljubljana is in the top 10, which probably many wouldn't expect. Budapest was also number 17 out of 42 in total. Sofia 20th, Krakow 26th, Warsaw 27th. So a lot of other cities actually below Central and Eastern European cities when it comes to these indicators. And in some ways, the cities haven't made the same mistakes in the past, and they can leapfrog a few things and avoid repeating some of the mistakes that other cities made, for example, for diesel cars in the past or diesel buses. And it's quite encouraging to see that also, for example, when you look at e-buses in particular, Sofia or the Tri-City in Poland, Gdansk, Gdynia, Sopot, they're quite strong. So it's really something where we also need to make sure that we don't see ourselves as weaker than we are. It's totally possible to make the change happen. So coming close to the end now, we have published a guidance on what makes a good low emission zone. I will not read to you all the details, but there's for us 7 key ingredients that are really important. The right communication, you have to do it
De
early.
van 7 főpont, az egyik a megfelelő kommunikáció.
Because if it's not enforced, if people are not following the rules, it's seen as very unfair and it will not deliver the benefits. You have to put in place the right complementary measures. So financial support, exemptions, so special rules, for example, for people that have a handicap and that need certain vehicles and so on. And you also need to provide really the right targeted approach to the people that otherwise couldn't make the change. For example, it can be for low-income households, or it can be for small and medium enterprises and so on. Then, of course, you always need to monitor the data. Without the data, you don't know if it's working and where you're going. You need to really have the right vision, so explain why it's necessary, and have a clear definition of the scope in the end. So if people know the objective, why you're doing it, it will be much easier to do. So our recommendations would be to really take inspiration from the best and then adapt it to your city. So if the city's policies, as large, stringent, and well-enforced as London, is as inclusive, well-communicated, and forward-looking as Amsterdam's low-emission zone, there is as many alternatives as in Paris, and you link it to a general redesign of traffic in a city like in Ghent, and then you find a balance to also have exceptions and exemptions for certain groups like in Brussels, then in our view, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can really build a well-designed low-emission zone. And I promised you some measures on how to make sure it's fair. So we analyzed a lot of research and examples on policies that combine fairness and effectiveness. And we selected a top 5. So scrappage schemes, helping certain groups to get rid of their car, either buy a new car or get something else in return, like a public transport ticket. That's very effective and can be done in the short term. You can support the purchase of bikes. You, of course, need to boost and make public transport cheaper. That's always something you should be doing in parallel, or ideally even before a low emission zone. There's the possibility of creating shared mobility hubs where all the shared services are in one place and it becomes a real alternative to car use. And that's being tested now in France primarily, social leasing of electric vehicles. In France, there's the ambition to offer a €100 per month leasing for small and light electric cars to certain income groups. So the poorest part of the population that really needs a car will get the help of the state. The state negotiates with the big companies to have a big fleet of leasing vehicles, and it becomes quite affordable. It's obviously not always the right solution for everybody. Some people don't want or need a car, but for those who really need it, it's a good solution. And yeah, these would be our analysis and recommendations on low emission zones. Thank you for listening to me. Sorry for the short interruption, but that's live, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much, Jens, for your super informative presentation and for the reflection to the challenges of our region of CEE. I would like to ask the audience, maybe we have time for like 1-2 questions if somebody wants to ask Jens. Now, is there anybody to ask questions? In the chat box, we don't have any yet. If not, then I think I would like to give the floor to Łukasz, and then yes, if it's okay for you, you can stay, but you can also leave it if it's not
If you want to stay, and I'll keep an eye on
Okay.
and listen to the example of Krakow. I'm really interested in seeing what's happening over there. So thank you very much, and I will follow. And I'm also available for questions later during the event if you want. And
thank you for the super concrete suggestions, recommendations. I think it's really inspiring, and it shows some opportunities to have debates in Hungary too. So now I would like to give the floor to Łukasz. Please, we are going to hear about the experience in Krakow in creating a low emission zone.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, thank you for invitation. And yeah, indeed, we are just before starting of the low emission zone in Krakow. So I have a few slides about the road, how was it difficult and challenging to implement it and to start with low emission zones, and what is the current situation. Okay, I will share my screen. Yeah, I hope it's visible and we can start. Okay, so low emission zone in Krakow, it's why actually Krakow decided to implement low emission zone? We are very beautiful city, and of course I invite you all the time to visit. But we are also in a deep valley, so during the winter time, and we have a lot of days without wind. The air pollution was very high before 2019. It was a very important date for us. In 2019, the city decided to forbidden coal heating, and it's not allowed anymore. And it was a huge increase of the quality of air, but mostly concerning particulate matters. And but for the society, for the inhabitants of the city, air quality is one of the key issues. So the push from the inhabitants to increase the quality of air is still one of the most important issues. And we knew that there are three actually sources of pollution. One is the heating system, which already was solved. Second is heating system, but outside of the city, in the metropolitan area. As we are in the valley, so all of the pollutions from the villages, small towns, satellite towns around the city, just go down to the city. And the road traffic, of course, both particular matters, but also something what is not enough appreciated in Polish cities, but I think in other also. So NOx, yes, and the pollution coming from the NOx. And we had started this discussion like more or less 2017-18 about pollutions from the road traffic, and the national law changed then, and we are able to start preparing, according to the law, a low emission zone. Before the date, it wasn't allowed according to the national law. But the law, which arose in this 2017 or something like that, 17-18, was not very good prepared, let's say like that, diplomatic way. And we decided to create a small low emission zone in 2019, basing on this national law. But actually, it was rather a zero emission zone than low emission zone. So the impact was huge. In part of the city center, there were for 1 month almost no cars because you are not allowed to enter if not hydrogen electric vehicles, so only zero emission vehicles. But of course, we were not enough prepared, and our fleet were not prepared to keep this kind of zero emission zone, especially from, there were some exceptions for inhabitants, but shopkeepers and from business side, there was much efforts to quit this zone. But that was the first step, which started all the process of the low emission zone right now. So we have made, like on the slide, a lot of researchers. Here you have NOx in street corridors in the city. You can see that it exceeds the current norms, but of course we know that already it's going to be lower than 40. So we knew that we have a problem with that. And the other issue was how to, we started to find out, trying to find out how to prepare the data necessary to start the public consultations with inhabitants. And we have contacted the institute, ICCT, the USA institute, but also the office from Berlin, and they supported us with idea of real emissions research. So as you can see on the slide, you have technology which enable you to measure real emissions coming from vehicles which are passing this stuff. And you can make, we have made, and this kind of researchers are making all around Europe. You can measure even 100,000 vehicles within 1 or 2 weeks. So we have a huge database, a huge information of real emissions, not this which are in homologation in the papers of the vehicles, because we already know that after the Dieselgate that what was declared by producers and what actually comes from vehicles, it's a completely different story. And these measurements proved what is already known all around the world. Diesel vehicles are the problem in cities. Diesel are 4 to 8 times higher emissions than petrol. And here you can also see the difference. This yellow line is what is declared by producers, and until Euro 6 norms, so Euro 5 even, the differences, especially as you can see in diesel case, yes, you can see that real emissions are a few times higher than it is in the papers of the vehicles. So we knew that we need to focus on diesel vehicles and on older cars, as a small percent of the fleet actually is responsible for the majority of emissions. Here you can see the percentage of vehicles which are on the street. When you make a real emission measurement, you got a feedback about really fleet which is on your streets. Not only registered vehicles in the city, but about the vehicles which entered the city all around the region or even country or tourist, like in the case of Krakow. So you can see how many percent of different Euro norms are present on the streets and what percentage it is in the NOx emissions. And then you can start basing with this information, with this data, you are able to start to public consultations and to talk with inhabitants, showing them, okay, here you can see what actually is polluting our air and what are we ready about cutting some of them. Because without public support, without public convenience, this kind of solutions like low emission zones are not possible. And of course, it's still emotional, it's still a tough issue, like it was in previous presentation.
Nagyon érdekes téma, és hallhattuk az előző prezentációban Londonnal kapcsolatban, de úgy gondolom, hogy ha megvan a jó felkészülés és a rendelkezésünkre állnak az adatok, akkor tényleg elkezdhetünk egy közös megbeszélést és vitát elindítani. 2022-ben elindítottunk egy közösségi konzultációt, nagyjából januárban, februárban. Különböző olyan különböző mértékeket néztünk meg, különböző időzónákat, hogy hogyan kellene visszaszorítani a légszennyezést például 2024-ig, és hogy 2030-ig hova szeretnénk ezt csökkenteni. Láthatjátok itt a térképen, hogy a második körút körül kellene beszorítani ezt a kibocsátást, és volt egy olyan javaslat, ahol látjuk az alsó szintnél, azt kellett 2022-ig elérni. Nagyon sokszor az ünnepek alatt nagyon sok olyan megbeszélésünk volt, vitánk a lakossággal, a különböző üzletekkel és üzletemberekkel, akikkel mondjuk olyan nagyjából 10 hónapos megbeszélés után nyilván számunkra világos volt, hogy az emberek nem szeretnének egyáltalán olyan támogatást, mert hiszen például olyanokat javasoltunk nekik, mint szabad, ingyenes tömegközlekedési bérleteket, hogy inkább azokat használják, és adják el azokat a járműveket, amelyek nem tudnának Krakkó utcáira rátérni. Biciklis javaslataink is voltak, és teljesen nyitottak voltunk minden olyan ötletre, amely tud minket támogatni, de az elvárás a lakosság számára az volt, hogy inkább legyen több idő, amellyel például ezt tudják majd használni. Tudom, hogy ez egy kicsit érdekes, de nem volt teljesen egyértelmű a lakosság számára sem, hogy az először egy kisebb térségbe szeretnénk ezt létrehozni, majd később...
A4 and S7, this is our motorway, highway ring road, which is in 75% ready. The last part is under construction, will be ready next year. So that was the idea to have first the second ring road and then fourth ring road. But during the discussions, public discussions, especially with City Council, which needs to approve finally the low emission zone, show up idea to have the whole city area. So of course, except the ring road, so it's a national road in the jurisdiction of the national of the government, but without this highway and short links, which comes to the highway, to the four ring, the whole city administration area within the administration line should be covered by low emission zone. The argument was that it's not for the councillors, which represent different regions. It was not clear how they should explain to the inhabitants that before the highway, their inhabitants will have a zone and after not, yes, or rather different. And okay, as a kind of negotiations, we need to approve it. Of course, it's not very common that you cover the whole city, but that was the idea coming from the public consultations and from the public debate. Finally, it was decided to start with the low emission zone with the very low rules on 1st of July 2024, so in a couple of months. But actually, the zone will be with the final rules, so with the final limits, implemented 2 years later in 2026, also 1st of July. And then it is the limits are that you need to have at least Euro 5 diesel vehicle and Euro 3 petrol vehicle. This is for the 2026. For the 2024, it is Euro 2 for diesel and Euro 1 for the petrol. So very, as you can see, it's 1% of the fleet plus 2% of the fleet. So it's 3% of the fleet. So it's not very high limit. But in 2026, it is more or less 20 to 25% of vehicles which were on the streets in 2019. So actually right now it's even less than 20%, especially that after implementation, the decision of implementation of the low emission zone, we see the huge decrease of buying of and registering new diesel vehicles, of course, especially those under Euro 5 norms. These vehicles were responsible, according to the measurements, for almost half of the emissions of the NOx. Yes, so moving out these vehicles from the streets should bring really a significant change in NOx, according to the scope of NOx pollution, which are measured on the streets. There are some exceptions. If you and what is also important, these rules comes for the vehicles which were registered before 1st of March this year, 2023. So we gave the city council decided in December 2022. So for the next 3 months, if people have already their car or buy this car before the 1st of March, for them limits are eligible in 2026. But for those who buy car after 1st of March 2023, in 2024 already are the higher limits. Yes, so these vehicles are already higher. The other exceptions is seniors, so for the inhabitants, but not only from the city of Krakow, but for people more over 70 years old. If they were 70 years old and they have registered their vehicle before 1st of March this year, it's also that they can enter the low emission zone. It was quite important expectation from public consultations that older people, they don't plan to change vehicles and they are not in this share of vehicles, an important number of vehicles. So it was from the social point of view and empathy, let's say, the expectation. And according to the law, there are also exceptions for people with reduced mobility, physical mobility, and there, of course, they have a blue card. Yeah, that's, I think, the major part of there are some like vehicles, food trucks, yes. So or the very old vehicles, historical vehicles, which are registered as a historical vehicle. These are only expectations. Others need to fit the limits. What is the alternative? In our opinion, after public consultations, 90 to 90, maybe even more % of people will change the vehicle. That's the declaration. That's why they didn't want to have a free public transport or some subsidy for e-bicycles or something else. They just want to change the vehicle for this one which meet the limits. But of course, there is not only for the city of Krakow, but for the metropolitan area where the income is a bit lower and the fleet is, of course, maybe not only metropolitan, but when we take into consideration the whole region, of course, there's a difference in, and they don't need to, their trips are more occasionally than regular, yes. So we show as an alternative from the very beginning that we want to create and increase the role of the public transport. And the black line is a metropolitan railway, which is after years of investments, new train stations, rebuilding the central line. It is already ready, and that's the core of the public transport, the metropolitan trains, which serve specific corridors, but the most important with the largest satellite cities. The red lines are the metro buses. So we have started a new service, which is not very common in Polish cities. You have a metropolitan buses like this on the picture, which serves every 15 minutes to the cities outside, to the corridors that, as you can see on the map, that we don't have a rail. So it's our rail, but on the road. And the high frequency and the direct service to the city center, it's a real alternative. Also, the park and rides are located close to these lines, to the metro buses and the railway lines. And that was one of the arguments showing up during the public consultations. If you have whole city, your park and rides within the city are also in the zone, so it's not very clever according to what was said. But in our opinion, our counter-argument was we don't want to have these cars entering our city, especially that sometimes park and rides are in the middle of some housing districts. We want you, if you travel by this kind of car, to quit your trip by car outside of the city, and there are a lot of park and rides close to the train stations, and as I mentioned, also to the metro bus lines, that it's possible. Yeah, metro, railway, what I already mentioned, and the last issue was this year we have implemented finally, which is not very, I know that I think in other cities, probably in Hungary also, the integration of different type of modes, so railway, buses, regional buses, interurban buses, metropolitan buses, city buses, trams, so on. It should be integrated, and after 2 years of preparations, we reached this. So as you can see here, we have 3 zones, and in Krakow there is possibility to choose if you want to have a ticket with or without railway. But when you have zone 2 and 3, there's only one ticket. So with 169 zloty, which is more or less 40 euro per month, you can travel whatever you want in the whole area. So it's 1 + 2 or 1 + 2 per 3 zones, and you can choose trains, buses, metro buses, regional buses, trams inside of the city. So all of this service is within this, we think, very nice price. And of course, you don't have to think about choosing this or this and what is for you preferable, but it also gives you an opportunity to travel in the metropolitan area, not only to between city of Krakow and the area outside. And just a few remarks finishing. Of course, this kind of initiatives and low emission zones face always criticism, always you need to fight for that. So after decision by the city council, there are 2 cases in court. So there are some, we need to face them. It's beginning of the next year. And there are several ideas to quit this low emission zone, mostly coming from outside of the city. So it's not fortunate we have elections, local elections next year, and it's part of the election time. But the initiatives rather are coming out from the city. So for those who occasionally wants to enter, they don't need to change the car because of where they live. But if they want to travel to Krakow, then it's some kind of problem for them, and they don't want to fit the rules. We'll see. It's the first low emission zone in Poland, so we will be the first who will check it. And one of the arguments in the court is that it's not facing the constitutional law freedom and so on. So it's very general and strategic arguments, but we'll see at the beginning. But of course, we strongly believe that it's not, there will be a positive finish of that. And cities and decision makers in city, there's a strong support, because what is the most important within the city of Krakow, inhabitants of Krakow, 75%, minimum 75% of inhabitants want to have a low emission zone in the city, and they support. Maybe they have some doubts if it should be the whole city or maybe a smaller area, but in general, the low emission zone is needed, and it's highly supported. So yeah, I hope next year it's going to start, and we'll make another steps for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Łukasz, for your presentation. So far, we have some questions from the audience also. So for the last couple of minutes, I would like to conclude the questions. So the audience asked about the financial part of the implementation of low emission zones. So how does it work? How much is the financial aspect? How can you deal with it? And the second question was about the legal framework, because in Hungary, many times we face with the challenges of the Hungarian legislation. And the third was about the criticism. You also touched this topic, the criticism from different stakeholders. So could you please give us some suggestions, both for questions for Jens and Łukasz? These three topics came to the mind of the audience. So what would you suggest for us, for Budapest, for Hungarians to tackle legislation, financial issues, and criticism from stakeholders?
The criticism you always have to face if you want to make a step further. So this is something that you don't have to be worried about. And what I said during the presentation, the most important is to present to inhabitants what you can achieve, yes, but basic on data, not only what we think, but basic on data, yes. That these 300 of low emission zones which already exist in Europe, it was always a success story. Okay, there are sometimes some, I don't know, questions why some cities in Germany already quit. They quit because they achieved the goal. The goal is to improve the air quality, and it happened everywhere. So you have a proof, yes, that it worked. You need to present it very precisely, very widely to the inhabitants. For us, the huge support was involvement of experts coming from healthcare. If you show to the people strong argument and strong proof that NOx is really increasing number of asthma or allergic children, yes, then how to, you know, to co-argument, yes. You cannot co-argument with the health of especially of the children, and that's the truth. Also, experts from vehicles engines, yes, because we are not ready to. There were, for example, very strong arguments to allow LPG vehicles, and only experts from engine from technical universities were able to face this and saying no, it's not the case. LPG is actually worse than petrol. So you need to involve experts to present all these arguments. From the financial point of view, it's not the case. In Poland, you are able to, like in Great Britain, to present rules that you can pay for entering. But we didn't decide to do that in Krakow because in our opinion, and it's actually proved during the consultation, you cannot, if you based on the health, you cannot pay for creating solution that if you are more rich and you can pay, you can produce pollution and pushing in for your health. Yeah, so you cannot, health and money is not the way that you can compare. I don't know if it's true or not, but that was our approach for that, right? And that's why, from the financial point of view, the system which will control, register, and control entering to the city to that it's low emission zone, and because it was one of the issues and very important things for the people, that it will be somehow checked, not only on the paper, but the zone will work. Yes. So we create the system with cameras and with registering plate, checking if the car is allowed. So it's like 250,000 euro cost. We just finished the public procurement, and it will be ready next year. So it's not a case of huge money. And if you don't create a system more complete, more detailed, more wide for the city, in my opinion, the money is not the case of low emission zone. It is also when you choose, we choose this Euro 5 and Euro 3 was basing in 2022. We were in the middle of the huge crisis after starting the war at Ukraine. So on the, for example, motorization market, we need to check out, if you say to the people, it's not only for the rich, because you can still change the car for the old but the petrol one, yes? Then it's also an argument. You don't have to spend a lot of money to make a change, yes? You need to sell your old diesel and buy old petrol. So it means that you don't have to invest a lot of money. And yeah, all of these arguments are very important, and you need to go through from place to place, from meeting to meeting, with support of external experts. And I think it's worth, I mean, and I hope, of course, we are on the second stage when you need to keep these rules and you need to fight in the court. But it's like everywhere, yeah. It's always finishing in the court, and court needs to decide if you are allowed or not. I hope the finish will be positive, and the zone will be ready and starting next year.
Thank you very much, Łukasz. Jens, do you have any comments or reflection to the thoughts of Łukasz, or do you want to add any suggestions?
Maybe some small additions only. I fully agree with what he said, and I think these were really useful comments coming from somebody who's working on this at the moment. So I think it confirms the arguments showing that it's possible to do that. On the cost of the enforcement, I think he said it. It's not really expensive. Also, you will have revenues if people pay a fine if they don't comply. So you can cover the costs of the policy through this. It's obviously not the goal to make money with this usually, but it is the idea to make sure that people do comply and that it doesn't come at a huge cost for the city. Also, we know you save a lot of money in terms of health costs, in terms of congestion, also in times, depending on how strict the policy is. But there's a lot of benefits for the city, not even speaking about the climate benefits. So I think it's definitely, financially speaking, a winning scheme. And then the legal aspects you mentioned, it's obviously true if there is a good national framework, it's much easier. For example, in the Netherlands, in Spain, in France, now also in Poland, luckily, there is a national framework that makes it easier to introduce these policies, and that gives legal certainty, and people know what to expect, and makes the life for cities so much easier. We're part of the European Commission expert group on these questions, and we try to convince them to support cities and not to make it harder for cities. So the Commission is not directly interfering with that, but some governments would like to make it harder for cities to introduce these measures, and some are very supportive, and of course supporting them is the right way to go. I don't know in detail the situation in Hungary, but I remember that it wasn't easy. So that's something also we know, the situation with the national government and then the mayor of Budapest, of course, it is a tricky one because they're not from the same political party. So that's something where if there's no clear legal avenue for this, then maybe looking at alternative solutions that are not only a low emission zone, but maybe traffic plans. So we know there have been quite some changes in Budapest recently with the chain bridge, for example, being close to traffic. So if the low emission zone doesn't work, there's other solutions that hopefully will be legally possible. But it is, of course, a problem if the law doesn't allow the cities to take action. And a final point on the communication, I think as Łukasz also said, you will always get the criticism. So it's to make sure that you get the criticism from the right people, and in the sense of, people that are unhappy, but they will be able to adapt. But you don't want to have a fight with the whole population, of course. So you need to really think about what I showed in terms of the measures that will help people to make the change, and you need to give them enough time. So I think it's not so important to start, as soon as possible, but you need to make a clear announcement, start preparing the ground, for example, with the bus lines that we saw for Krakow. So really giving lead time to people to get used to it, change their habits a bit. Don't introduce it overnight. In some cities that was done like with very short lead time, and then that leads to a lot of frustration. So that's for us part of the success stories that you need to look at. Give enough time, prepared well, communicate it, give people an easy way to check if their vehicle is allowed or not. For example, on a website. In some cities they also have like at certain places a machine where you can enter your registration code and check. So there's definitely like, to almost all the problems, there's already a solution somewhere in Europe, and it's all about using these solutions basically. That's, I think, all I can add for now, but happy to see if there's maybe further questions.
Thank you very much for both of you. I think that we are running out of our time. Our translators also had the program for 1 hour, so I would like to say a huge thanks to you, Jens, and Łukasz, and also to our translators, and also to the audience, Hungarian audience who came to listen to this program. I'm really happy that we could organize this. Thank you for coming, sharing your suggestions. I think it was super inspiring for us in Budapest and in Hungary, for Hungarian cities. Then I wish you good luck with the project in Krakow, Łukasz, and also we meet tomorrow, I think, with the Clean Cities campaign summit, I think on Thursday. So thank you very much for all of you, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.